I recently created a video on my YouTube channel about how to be a great panelist. Should you ever be asked to be on a panel at a conference or another event, that video should be popping up there somewhere in the corner. And this video is for those who have been asked or volunteered to be a moderator of a panel, because moderating a panel is a challenge unto itself. I had this idea for creating these two videos because I've been going to Toastmasters for the last 8 years, and one of our Toastmasters Club members recently hosted a panel, and it was the first time I had seen a panel done at a Toastmasters meeting, which is crazy because when you go to actual conferences, usually more than half of the sessions are related to panels. And being on a panel or moderating a panel is much different than speaking as just yourself on stage to many people out in the crowd. So I wanted to create these two videos to give you some inspiration and confidence going into a panel session, whether you're a panelist, which is that other video, or in this video, moderating a panel yourself. Hey everyone, my name is Wade Patterson. My whole YouTube channel is all about impactful communication. Very simply, if you want to be a better communicator, consider subscribing to my channel. The first step to moderating a great panel is to pick an interesting subject, if you have the choice of what subject you're going to be covering. And number two is to pick great panelists. So in terms of the subject, I want you to think about if you were attending an event and there were many options on the agenda, what could you describe that would really draw in your attention? Maybe that's a catchy title that really spices up the subject matter that you're going to be covering, or an interesting 1 or 2 sentences as part of that panel description. Put a lot of thought into that, because that simple act of naming your panel and giving it a great description could be the difference in whether many people attend that panel session, especially if you're competing with other sessions, or a much smaller amount of people if it doesn't sound that interesting or it sounds generic. So you want to think up something that is going to be interesting and add value to your audience. And then you want to pick great panelists. And there can be a lot of factors that go into this. You may be in a situation where you have zero choice over the panelists, but if you do have the opportunity, try to pick individuals who obviously are experienced and can share a lot of knowledge with regard to the subject, but also aim to have a little bit of a diversity in terms of the panelists. And diversity comes in many forms. The first, of course, is diversity of people, whether that's different backgrounds, whether that's a nice balance of men and women, but then also diversity of opinions, because there is nothing worse than watching or listening to a panel discussion and all the panelists say the exact same thing, or one panelist gives an answer, they answer the question, and then the moderator says, okay, how about you, Susie? And Susie says, yeah, exactly what Peter just said. There's no point having multiple people. You could just have one person if that was the scenario. So you want to ensure that, not that people are going to disagree per se, but that they'll bring different perspectives to your panel conversation and offer different points of view. Beyond the diversity of your panelists, if you're wondering about how many panelists is the right number, it varies, but often I think 2 or 3 is the magic number. If you have too many more than that, they won't get a lot of speaking time likely. And if you only have one panelist, it's kind of more like an interview style and you're only getting one perspective. So I think 2 or 3 panelists is the right number. Once you picked your panelists, you want to ensure that these people are prepared and that you are prepared. And the best panel moderators often set up a pre-interview call that can be over Zoom. It can be in person if you're in the same location, but you want to get the panelists together first off so they can familiarize themselves with each other if they've never met in the past, but second, so that you can explain all of the housekeeping items and the structure and what they can expect. Because the more prepared your panelists are, the more they're going to relax when it comes to the actual event, and they will answer in a natural way because there's not a lot of surprises or shocks that are going to come at them on the day of. While you're meeting with your panelists, you may want to give them some key information, such as the topics and themes that you hope to discuss. Now, I'm not saying you have to give the panelists their questions verbatim, because I actually think as a good moderator, you may veer away from questions that you were prepared on asking, depending how the panel goes. So you need to be willing to adapt, but give them a general idea of the themes of what you're going to be discussing so that they can start to formulate effective responses in their own minds. When it comes to the day of your panel, remember that your goal as moderator is to make your panelists shine and to give the audience a great session. To start off the panel, you can give a little bit of an introduction, but don't spend too much time doing this, because you want to give your panelists the maximum amount of time behind the mic to give their answers and to really be seen as the experts on the subject. But you can give a short introduction, which sets the tone for the audience. And then I always think it's a great idea to have a quick little bio or information about the panelists. Of course, you can ask the panelists to introduce themselves, but I always find hosts or moderators who are able to give the audience that information up front, first off, come across as more prepared, but second, it's a nice thing for the panelists. They come on stage, they've been introduced properly, and now they can jump right into the subject matter. One of the trickier parts of moderating a panel is ensuring that there's a level of balance in speaking time amongst the panelists. And great panelists should be able to acknowledge this and realize if they're talking a little bit long, but sometimes that doesn't happen and people like to hog the microphone. And if you need to jump in, which I suggest you do if they are talking for an abnormally long amount of time, do so with grace, because that individual may not realize that they've been talking way too long, and you don't want to take away their enthusiasm, but at the same time, you want to respect the rest of the panelists and give them an opportunity to shine as well. So my suggestion is, if somebody is talking for an extraordinary amount of time, find your spot, maybe in between sentences, to jump in and say, Julie, that's great information. Thank you so much. I want to ensure all the panelists get a chance to chime in on this. Bob, what are your thoughts on what Julie was just saying? Something like that, where it's not offensive. You're not being rude to Julie. You're explaining that she's given a great answer. Thank you so much for that insight and that knowledge. And now over to Bob to keep things flowing. Hopefully this is something you never have to deal with moderating a panel. I will say it's pretty rare because most people have that level of awareness, but I have seen it from time to time. And the times that I've witnessed a moderator observing this and not doing anything, it feels awkward. And I think the whole audience will respect the fact, if you are the moderator, that you can jump in and ensure that your panel has a great flow to it. The best panel moderators don't rely too heavily on notes. I know this is difficult because you have questions prepared that you're hoping to ask these individuals, and you're probably thinking, how on earth can I keep all of these questions straight in my head, especially if I've told some of the panelists what I'm going to ask them. I need to make sure that the questions aren't throwing them off. I understand those are all valid concerns. The first tip is to practice without your notes as much as possible so that these topics are fresh in your head when you go to deliver the actual panel or moderate the actual panel. But the second piece of advice is to have cue cards or subtle information rather than a big piece of paper that you're holding up reading off questions. And if you have the luxury of having a side table, so if you're the moderator and you have your panelists beside you and you have a little side table in between, that's the perfect place to keep your notes. And then you can ask the question, maintain eye contact as the panelists are answering, give them those nonverbal cues, but then from time to time, you can glance down as a little reminder to the question that you're going to ask next. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of keeping the time within the panelists somewhat even. The next tip is to be observant or understand the full timing of the panel, because usually panel sessions happen at conferences or events where there's a much larger agenda, and you going too long with your panel or making it not long enough could really impact the agenda and the rest of the day's events. So be mindful of the total amount of time. And if there's a particular subject matter that you really want to talk about, but you notice the panel is going slower in terms of, wow, I was going to ask 3 more questions before I got to this really important topic and half our time is already done, pivot, transition, ask that really important question, adjust the structure of the interview. The panelists will understand what you're doing because you want to deliver the audience with the most valuable information. And that is your job and duty, to make the panelists shine, to keep everything on time, but also to ensure that the best questions are being asked and the best information is being given out. Great panel moderators also incorporate the audience when possible. You can do this in a variety of ways, but one of my favorite things to do when moderating a panel is to tell the audience early what the structure is and encourage them to ask questions by saying, you know, the best panels I've ever moderated are the ones where the audience asks the majority of the questions. Therefore, we have a couple of mics being run around. Put up your hand if you have a question, or maybe you have a stationary microphone and you encourage the audience to go line up if they do have a question. Maybe you don't want it to be dominated by audience questions. That's okay. So you can set the tone by saying, at the end of the session, we're going to have about 5 minutes. So if there's a burning question that you have, be prepared for the end. I promise we'll get to a few questions at that point. I've also seen panels incorporate technology. So there's certain apps and websites. One that comes to mind is called Mentimeter, where you can have the audience type in their questions. And if you have a screen or a display, those questions will pop up in real time. Or if you don't, you can have the app on your phone and you will see the questions coming in. That takes a little bit of multitasking to see the audience questions, but it's a great way to incorporate the audience and ensure that the things that are important to them are getting answered as well. At the end of the panel, you want to wrap it up very nicely, wrap it up with a bow. Thank your panelists for their time. If there's an opportunity to summarize some of the points, that is another kind of next level skill, to be able to be thinking as they're responding, doing that active listening. And then at the end, talk about some of the major themes that were covered and some points. Do so. But just like the introduction, don't take too much time away from the panelists in order to do your summary. The most important thing is that you thank them and that you deliver any housekeeping or important items to the audience that they need to know, whether that's part of the bigger conference or how they can get in touch with these panelists if they have further questions, information like that. I hope this video on how to moderate a panel session at a conference or other event was beneficial to all of you moderators. By the way, if you're being asked to moderate a panel, good for you. You clearly have a great skill set in dealing with people. So that is fantastic. And don't forget about the sister video to this one, which is how to be a great panelist. That will be linked to at the bottom. Regardless of how you landed on this video, thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Please consider subscribing to my channel because I will continue to put out videos to make you a better public speaker and overall a better communicator. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you on the next video.